He thought he owned the courtroom, a smug judge who mocked a young man in a uniform, calling it a costume and demanding he sit down. But what he didn't know, that man was Sergeant First Class Eli Brenner, a tomb guard and a Medal of Honor recipient. What happened next turned the courtroom into a monument of silence, respect, and reckoning, and it cost the judge everything. For more true stories that reveal the power of quiet heroes, subscribe to this channel now. It was the kind of courtroom morning that buzzed louder than it should have. Cameras flicked on before the first gavel. Suits filed in like parade floats, all silk ties and sideways glances. Reporters leaned forward from their benches, mouths half open, pens twitching to catch anything that might go viral. The judge hadn't even walked in yet, but already the air felt preloaded with spectacle, with performance, with the kind of heavy silence that comes before the fireworks. Near the back, a door opened without a sound. The man who stepped in didn't belong to any firm or press crew. No camera followed him. No one stood to greet him. He walked with the slow certainty of someone who had long since stopped caring whether rooms made space for him or not. His uniform army dress blues fit, like it had once been tailored for a younger man. Now it sat a little loose in the shoulders, a little short at the cuffs, its edges softened with time. The brass buttons had dulled to a dark gold, the fabric just slightly faded in the light. But it was clean, immaculate, pressed with care. He moved without hesitation, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. He found a seat in the last row on the left side, and sat without shifting. No sigh, no fidget, just stillness. A young bailiff near the sidewall glanced over, furrowed his brow. The uniform caught his eye first, then the man's bearing straight-backed, hands folded calmly in his lap. A few whispered words passed between court staff. No one approached. Not yet. The old man's eyes never wandered. Not to the polished oak of the judge's bench, not to the chattering suits. He looked at the flag mounted behind the court seal, and that was it. He didn't speak. He didn't move. If you weren't looking closely, you wouldn't have noticed the faint blue ribbon tucked beneath his collar, just peeking out above the second button. It was easy to miss. But for those who knew what it meant, those who had ever stood in the silence after gunfire, or carried more weight home than they left with it, meant everything. Judge Ronald Kessler entered the courtroom the way some men take the stage kin lifted, shoulders square, eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for a spotlight. He wore the robe like armor, but not the kind meant to protect justice. It was the kind that asked to be admired. The room shifted the moment he stepped in. Conversations died mid-whisper. Phones were tucked away. Reporters leaned just a little closer to their recorders, ready for the opening line. The courtroom had seen its share of high-profile hearings, but when Kessler presided, it always felt more like a production than a proceeding. He paused before taking the bench, scanning the gallery like an actor measuring his audience. His gaze swept over reporters in the back row, over the legal teams flanking both sides of the aisle, and just briefly over a man in faded army dress blues seated near the exit door. His eyes passed right over the uniform at first. Then they came back. Slower. There it was, the faint glint of a blue ribbon, half tucked beneath the old man's coat, just enough exposed to be seen by anyone looking close enough. Kessler's lips didn't move, but something in his posture changed, a tightening, a flare of nostrils, a flicker of disdain he thought no one noticed. But someone did. A clerk, standing behind him with a folder full of case files, saw the shift in his expression. A flash of something sharp and dismissive. Kessler took his seat, adjusting the microphone like a conductor testing sound levels. He cleared his throat louder than necessary, then scanned the room one more time as silence settled. For weeks now, he'd been pressing a new courthouse policy, decorum standards, he called it. No uniforms in the gallery. No overt shows of military symbolism during civilian trials. It wasn't written into law, but Kessler liked the message it sent. This is my room. not yours. He didn't speak to the old man that morning. Didn't call him out. Not yet. But the moment he saw that ribbon, that tiny sliver of silk so full of weight, the judge made a silent decision. He wasn't going to let it pass. Not in his courtroom. And the fuse, though quiet, had already been lit. It was during the mid-morning recess when the silence cracked. The courtroom lights hummed above like a soft warning, and the legal teams had risen from their seats to confer in hushed clusters. Reporters moved around quietly, gathering whispers and side-eyes for headlines. Some leaned back in their seats, scrolling through their phones. And amid the low tide of murmurs, the old man stood. No announcement, no drama. Just a slow, steady rise from the bench near the back wall. He didn't speak, didn't wave or motion. He simply stood, spine straight, hands behind his back, eyes fixed again on the flag above the judge's bench. He might have stood to stretch, or to honor something unseen. No one asked, but someone noticed. Judge Kessler stepped back into the room early. He wasn't expected for another few minutes, but he liked the way people stiffened when he returned unannounced. His eyes scanned the room again. Habit, control, performance. Then he saw the man standing. He stopped short of the bench. Something in him tightened. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and without warning, let his voice ring out across the room. "Sir," he said, drawing every eye toward the back, "this isn't a parade ground. You can take off the costume." The room went still. A beat of stunned silence held the air hostage. Kessler didn't stop. "We don't play military here. You want to make a statement, do it somewhere else. This is a court of law." A few quiet snickers rippled from the gallery. One reporter coughed into a grin. The old man didn't move. Not a flinch. Not a blink. He simply sat back down with the same deliberate grace he'd stood with. No rebuttal. No defense, just stillness. A young woman near the front slowly turned in her seat, eyes narrowing. Beside her, an older man in a charcoal suit shifted forward slightly. Underneath the cuff of his sleeve, the outline of a ranger tab caught the light. "That's not a costume," he said quietly, almost to himself. And this time, no one laughed. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back after a storm. Attorneys lingered by the rail, their voices low and guarded. Reporters filed out with their heads down, already thumbing headlines into glowing screens. No one said it out loud, but something had shifted. That wrong note struck and left to ring. Judge Kessler remained at his bench longer than usual, shuffling paperwork he wasn't reading. His expression was unreadable, but not from lack of feeling. It was the practiced face of a man who had long ago learned how to wear detachment like a second robe. Bailiff Harris waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching. He was young, early 20s, but there was a sincerity in him that hadn't yet been scrubbed clean by the job. He paused near the steps leading up to the bench and cleared his throat once. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "can I have a word?" Kessler didn't look up. "If it's about the docket, I already—" "It's not the docket, sir," Harris said. "It's about earlier, the man in the uniform." Now the judge looked up. Just barely. "What about him?" Harris shifted his weight, eyes flicking briefly toward the door. "You might want to reconsider what you said. He wasn't just anyone." Kessler leaned back slightly in his chair, arms folding over his chest. "I don't care if he's Patton's ghost. He disrupted court protocol. That uniform doesn't give him a free pass." Harris blinked, jaw tightening. He looked down for a beat before raising his gaze again. "Sir," he said, softer now, "he's a tomb guard." Kessler didn't react. "And he wears the Medal of Honor." That landed differently. The judge's brow twitched, only slightly. But it was there a flicker of uncertainty that passed as quickly as it came. Then he exhaled through his nose and waved a dismissive hand. "Doesn't change courtroom policy," he muttered. "This is my room." Harris said nothing, just nodded once, tight and small, and turned away. But in the silence that followed, the gavel on the desk seemed to weigh heavier than it had before, and for the first time all day, Kessler didn't feel quite so tall. By 8:42 the next morning, the courtroom was already full. Staff moved faster than usual, files shuffled with urgency, voices quieter, eyes sharper. Something had changed, not officially, not out loud, but the tension carried like static across the gallery. No one said his name, because no one yet knew it, but they all knew he was coming back. And then he did. The doors opened, slow and soft, and there he was. Same boots, same uniform, same deliberate steps. But this time, something was different. The blue ribbon was no longer tucked beneath the collar. It rested plainly now against the dark fabric of his jacket. A deep silk blue, frayed ever so slightly at the edges, but unmistakable. No one needed to be told what it was. The Medal of Honor ribbon didn't require introduction, not to anyone who'd ever seen it. And even those who hadn't still seemed to sense the weight of it. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the old man walked past the rows, posture straight, expression unreadable. He took his seat in the same bench, back row, left side, folded his hands, said nothing. This time, heads turned. Not just one or two, almost all. A ripple moved through the gallery like wind in a wheat field. Conversations halted mid-word. Even the stenographer paused her keystrokes. Judge Kessler entered a minute later. He was on time, but already too late to set the tone. The energy in the room wasn't his anymore. Still, he tried. He walked briskly to the bench, straightened his robe, and cleared his throat as if blowing smoke out of a room full of oxygen. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned forward over the mic and looked toward the back of the gallery. Right at him. "If you insist on violating courtroom standards," he said, his voice louder than necessary, "I'll have you removed." There were no laughs this time, only stillness. A camera clicked once. Then again, a reporter near the side aisle raised her phone slowly, deliberately hit record, and didn't look away. No one moved, no one spoke, but the air had thickened. The silence had weight now. And for the first time, it wasn't just watching the judge. It was watching him. It started with the scrape of a single chair leg against the polished floor, sharp, deliberate, and louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. Second row, center aisle. A man in a charcoal gray suit stood slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't ask permission. He simply rose, turned to face the bench, and buttoned his jacket with the precision of someone who'd done everything in life the hard way and never asked for applause. Colonel Martin Gray, retired. He was known in the legal world sharp, methodical, the kind of attorney who won cases not with theatrics, but with memory and presence. But few knew what came before the courtroom. Fewer still remembered the chestful of ribbons that now rested quietly at home in a glass case. Today, though, he didn't rise as an attorney. He rose as something else. "Your Honor," Gray said evenly, not loud but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. "With respect, I feel compelled to correct the record." Kessler blinked, caught mid-glare. "You just threatened to remove a Medal of Honor recipient from this courtroom." A ripple went through the gallery, soft gasps, a shuffle of feet, the kind of quiet that doesn't die but freezes in place. Colonel Gray turned slightly, gesturing not dramatically, but with a kind of solemn reverence toward the man in the back. "Sergeant First Class Eli Brenner," he said. "Tomb Guard, 3rd Infantry Regiment. One of only a handful who stood 21 hours under sniper fire in Ramadi. Didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't fall." The room went dead still. Kessler opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Gray's eyes didn't waver. "He earned the ribbon he wears," he continued. "And this court should be standing, not threatening." A reporter lowered her phone slowly, no longer recording for views, just listening. A woman near the gallery dabbed at her eyes. And from the bench, Judge Kessler looked suddenly very, very small. No one breathed. No one dared. Because the weight in the room no longer belonged to the robe. It belonged to the ribbon. Colonel Gray didn't sit back down. He didn't need to. His words had shifted something in the air undeniable, irreversible. Kessler leaned forward slightly, lips parted as if he meant to reassert control. But the room had already moved on without him. He might have worn the robe, but he no longer held the gavel. Not in spirit. Not anymore. Gray turned to face the gallery, not with drama, but with the quiet authority of a man who had spent years commanding silence. "Some of you may not recognize him," he said, gesturing again to the back row. "But that man, Sergeant First Class Eli Brennerhass, stood longer and steadier than any of us ever will. Not just at Arlington, where he watched over the unknowns in rain and snow, but in places with names that don't make the news anymore. Ramadi, Mosul, Firebase Anvil. Places where silence wasn't respected was survival." And then, slowly, the courtroom changed. A man near the side aisle stood, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, wearing a mechanic's shirt with grease still on the cuffs. He didn't raise his voice. "He saved me in Helmand," he said, simply. "Pulled me out after the blast. I was 19. No one asked for his name. No one had to." 2 rows behind him, a woman rose. She held a weathered photo in her hands, the edges curled and softened by years of holding on. Her voice cracked, but didn't break. "He carried my brother's body home. Wouldn't leave him behind. They said the terrain was too rough. He went anyway." A pause. "He was 19 too." Another man stood by the door. Then another. Not in unison. Not rehearsed. Each one bore something: an old injury, a memory, a silence only people like Brenner ever truly understand. They spoke in fragments, quiet testimonies. Some only nodded. Some placed a hand over their heart. And, suddenly, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a monument. Kessler sat frozen behind the bench, surrounded by something his authority couldn't reach: reverence. Earned, not granted. What began as arrogance had unraveled into reckoning. And no one could stop it now. The silence that followed the last testimony stretched long and thick, the kind of quiet that hangs after a final bell tolls. No one dared shift. Even the fluorescent hum overhead seemed subdued, as if the lights themselves had bent to the weight of the moment. And then the old man stood. He rose without ceremony. No clearing of the throat, no dramatic pause. Just the slow, quiet motion of a man who had spent his life moving with intention. He stepped forward once, then twice, until he stood just clear of the last row. His shoulders were square. His hands are steady. When he spoke, his voice didn't climb, it settled. "I didn't come here to be honored," Eli Brenner said. "I came to support a young privatone of mine who's being wrongfully charged." The courtroom remained frozen, all eyes locked on him. He wasn't reading from notes. There was nothing scripted, nothing polished, but every word landed like it had been carved from stone. "I've stood for a lot of things in my life," he continued, voice even, almost too quiet. "For the flag. For the ones who never made it back. For silence that means something. But I never stood for applause. And I never wore this." He paused, fingers moving to the top button of his dress coat for show. One by one, he undid the buttons. There was a rustle of fabric, a hush of breath. He parted the coat, and the Medal of Honor lay visible against the pressed blue of his uniform. The ribbon is no longer hidden. The 5-pointed star gleamed in the courtroom light, not brightly, but undeniably. Not flashy, just real. "You called it a costume," Brenner said quietly, eyes fixed on the bench. "You called me out of order, and that tells me everything." Kessler didn't move. His face had drained of color, the confidence hollowed out behind his eyes. Brenner didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there unchanged, unmoved as if he had just repeated the weather. Truth spoken plainly, without anger. And yet somehow it thundered. Because when the truth comes from someone who's never asked to be heard, it doesn't need to shout to shake the walls. The footage surfaced before the courthouse lights had cooled. A grainy clip, shaky hands, muted courtroom acoustics, but none of that mattered. You could hear the judge's words clearly enough. And you could see the old man rise, see the ribbon, hear the silence that followed. By the end of the day, it was everywhere. News anchors leaned into it with cautious reverence. Pundits tried to spin it, but couldn't find footing. Because this wasn't politics. This wasn't a scandal. This was something older, deeper something that didn't play well with sound bites. They called it the gavel moment. Clips of Judge Kessler's voice dismissing the medal as a costume made their way into living rooms, veterans' halls, and front pages. But it was the moment Brenner unbuttoned his coat, revealed the medal, and said nothing but truth that was what caught fire. By morning, the courthouse was no longer just a building. It was a destination. A line of reporters stretched down the sidewalk, cameras hoisted on shoulders, waiting not for Kessler, but for the man in the back row. He never came. Kessler's office released a statement. Then, another. Then, nothing. Pressure mounted. Veterans groups issued joint letters. Medal of Honor recipients from 3 wars demanded accountability. The American Legion called it a breach of public trust, wrapped in ignorance. On the second evening, Judge Ronald Kessler resigned. No press conference, no televised apology, just a single page filed quietly and without ceremony. The cameras didn't follow him to his car. They didn't care where he went. They were still waiting outside the courthouse, still hoping to catch sight of Eli Brenner. But Brenner didn't want the mic. When a reporter finally did track him down outside a quiet diner 2 towns over, all he said was, "I didn't stand for that." He gestured gently, vaguely, like brushing something off his sleeve. "I stood for something else." He didn't define it. He didn't need to. Because by then, most people already understood, and the courtroom, once ruled by a voice behind the bench, had been claimed quietly, irrevocably by the man who never raised his. The sky above Arlington was a quiet kind of blue, the kind that doesn't call attention to itself, but still manages to feel vast and reverent. A breeze moved through the trees gently, as if even the wind had learned to lower its voice here. The tourists gathered in respectful silence, shoes scuffing lightly on stone, cameras clutched but unused. They watched the sentinel move measured, flawless, 21 steps and a turn, rifle balanced with sacred precision. The changing of the guard happened every hour, every day, through heat, rain, snow, and thunder. It had become ritual, yes, but never routine. Among the visitors that morning stood a group of school children, flanked by teachers and parents. Some whispered to each other. Others simply stared eyes wide, the gravity of the place settling over them in real time. It was one boy, maybe 9 or 10, who first saw it. Just off to the side of the main path, tucked beneath the shadow of a weeping cherry tree, stood a low stone plaque symbol, weathered, set back from the flow of foot traffic. It bore no emblem, no flourish, just a few lines carved deep into the stone. In honor of Sergeant First Class Eli Brenner, whose silence stood louder than any gavel. The boy read it once. Then again. His brow furrowed, not with confusion, but with the weight of something too big to name. "Who's he?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. A chaperone stepped closer, glanced at the plaque, and said softly, "He was one of the quiet ones." No one took photos. There was no ceremony, no floral wreath. Just stillness, just the soft sound of boots on marble, and a ribbon of wind threading through the trees. Brenner wasn't there. Not in body, but he didn't need to be. Because some men never stop guarding what matters. Even after the medals are folded, even after the crowds leave, even when no one is watching. And in the silence between footsteps, somewhere beyond the bronze rifles and white gloves, his presence lingered. Not loud, not visible, just there, as it had always been.